The Intruder. There are moments in life that divide everything into before and after. For some, it's the birth of a child or the death of a parent. For others, it's the day they meet the love of their life or suffer a tragic accident. For me and 26 other seniors at Millfield High, it was a perfectly ordinary Friday in March when a stranger decided our school would be the stage for his madness. It was 7th period calculus with Mr. Denton, that magical last class on the last day before spring break. Outside, the March sun slanted through the windows in dusty yellow bars, promising warmth and freedom. Inside, not a single one of us could focus on derivatives or integrals or whatever the hell was supposed to be on the lesson plan. Even Mr. Denton knew it was a lost cause. He was one of those rare teachers who remembered what it was like to be young, to feel that electric anticipation of a week's freedom trembling just beyond your fingertips. While other teachers were cramming in last-minute tests, Mr. Denton had pulled up sportscle.com on the classroom's projector and divided us into teams for trivia games. I was sitting between my best friend Tyler and Jessica Miller, the girl I'd had a crush on since sophomore year. My team was up by 3 points, and I remember feeling that particular kind of contentment that comes when you're surrounded by friends, anticipating something good, and the world seems momentarily perfect in its ordinariness. Adidas. Tyler called out as the logo flashed on screen, and Mr. Denton clicked to award us another point. That's when it happened, the moment that would forever divide my life into before and after. The classroom speaker crackled to life, and Dean Harmon's voice cut through our laughter. I'd never heard him sound like that before, like a man who's just seen his own death coming for him. Attention, all faculty. This is not a drill. Initiate lockdown procedures immediately. This is not a drill. The room fell silent. 27 pairs of eyes turned to Mr. Denton, whose face had drained of all color. For one frozen second, nobody moved. Then Mr. Denton snapped into action, his normally casual demeanor replaced by something tight and focused. He sprinted to the door, checking that it was locked, then killed the lights and closed the blinds with quick, efficient movements. Everyone to the back corner. Now, no talking. His voice had dropped an octave, deadly serious in a way that made my skin prickle with gooseflesh. We moved like a herd of spooked deer, tripping over backpacks and bumping into desks as we crowded into the far corner of the room, the one spot not visible from a classroom door's narrow window. Mr. Denton positioned himself at the front of our group, a human shield between us and whatever threat had triggered this response. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing I'd ever felt. You could hear individual breaths, the squeak of a sneaker against linoleum, the soft whimper of someone trying desperately not to cry. 2 minutes crawled by, each second stretching to painful lengths. Then the faint electrical buzzing from the utility panel at the back of the room abruptly ceased, plunging us into deeper silence. The school had cut power. That's when the reality of our situation truly hit me. This wasn't a drill or a precaution. Something terrible was happening. Tyler's hand found mine in the dark, squeezing so hard it hurt. Jessica was pressed against my other side, her body trembling slightly. I could smell her shampoo, something fruity and light that seemed obscenely out of place in that moment of gathering dread. "Do you think it's a shooter?" someone whispered, giving voice to the fear that had taken root in all our minds. "Shut up," hissed Mr. Denton. Not a sound. The minutes stretched on, marked only by shallow breathing and the thundering of my own heart. Maybe 5 minutes passed, maybe 10. Time had lost all meaning in that darkened corner. And then we heard it, a man's voice, screaming from somewhere in the building. At first, it was distant, muffled by walls and closed doors, but unmistakably filled with rage. Raw, animal rage that made my blood run cold. "What the fuck is that?" Tyler breathed into my ear, his voice barely audible. I shook my head, unable to answer, unable to process what we were hearing. The screaming grew louder, punctuated now by the sound of something heavy hitting metal, lockers being struck or kicked. I realized he was in our hallway. I'll kill all of you. The voice was closer now, clear enough to make out the words. It didn't sound human anymore, more like some rabid animal wearing a man's vocal cords, howling promises of death. Beside me, Melissa Chun and Alyssa Park had started crying, soft hiccuping sobs they were desperately trying to muffle behind their hands. Mr. Denton shot them a warning look, but it was too late. The banging moved from the lockers to our classroom door, sudden and violent enough to make several of us jump. Bam! 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 The door shuddered in its frame with each impact. "I know you're in there," the voice growled, suddenly lower, somehow more terrifying in its controlled menace than in its previous screaming rage. "Open the door." Alyssa's soft crying broke into a full sob. "No," she gasped, the word escaping before she could catch it. The pounding intensified, the door rattling on its hinges. I found myself staring at that door, wondering how much force it would take to break it down, wondering if this was how I was going to die, huddled in a calculus classroom with a girl I'd never worked up the courage to ask out and a best friend I'd known since kindergarten. "Open this fucking door." Each word was punctuated by a blow that seemed to shake the entire wall. I could hear the wood beginning to splinter. Mr. Denton had his phone out. I noticed, texting something with one hand while holding a fire extinguisher he'd grabbed from the wall in the other. His knuckles were white against the red metal. The banging continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Each impact sent a jolt through my body, like my heart was connected to that door, and every blow was striking me directly. I thought about my parents, who were probably at work, completely unaware that their son was trapped in a dark classroom with a madman just feet away. I thought about all the stupid things I'd worried about that morning, a zit on my chin, whether the shirt I'd chosen was trying too hard, if I'd ever work up the courage to talk to Jessica about prom. Then, as suddenly as it began, the banging stopped, the voice continued down the hall, its terrible promises fading into unintelligible echoes. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. We all sat frozen, as if the slightest movement might bring him back. I realized I'd been holding my breath and let it out slowly, the sound startlingly loud in the renewed silence. 10 minutes later, though it felt like days, the speaker crackled back to life. Dean Harmon's voice returned, steadier now, but still carrying an edge of tension. "Attention faculty and students. The immediate threat has been contained, but as a precaution, we will maintain lockdown status. Teachers, you may resume instruction, but keep all doors locked and do not release any students for any reason until further notice." Mr. Denton didn't move from his position, didn't turn the lights back on. Instead, he checked his phone, reading something with intense concentration. Only then did he address us. "Everyone okay?" he asked softly, scanning our faces in the dim light filtering through the blinds. We nodded, none of us trusting our voices. "What happened?" Tyler finally asked, breaking the silence. Mr. Denton hesitated. "Someone entered the building. They're not sure if he's armed, but they're taking every precaution." "Is he still in the school?" Jessica asked, her voice small. "They've done a sweep and can't find him. Police are on their way. We're going to stay right here until we get the all clear." We spent the rest of what should have been our last period before spring break sitting in that darkened classroom. Nobody suggested returning to the quiz game. Nobody suggested anything at all. We just sat, some of us texting parents or friends in other classrooms, others staring blankly at the wall or floor. I kept thinking about the door, about how close it had come to breaking, about what would have happened if it had. At 3:15, 15 minutes after school should have ended. Dean Harmon's voice returned one final time to announce that police had secured the building and buses would begin loading immediately. Parents had been notified and would be allowed to pick up their children at the football field. We were to proceed directly to our designated exits in single file, escorted by faculty, as we gathered our things, moving with the stunned slowness of survivors after a disaster. Mr. Denton finally explained what had happened. A man, later described by local news as mentally unstable, had entered the building through the main entrance. In those days, before Parkland and Sandy Hook had made schools fortresses of metal detectors and ID scanners, our school was embarrassingly easy to access. The man had assaulted Mrs. Pinsky, the front desk receptionist, who had managed to flee the building screaming, alerting a campus supervisor who had initiated the lockdown. I didn't learn the rest until that night, when the whispers and rumors began circulating through texts and social media. According to Joey Alvarez, whose dad was one of the responding officers, the night janitor found a man sleeping in a storage closet near the art wing around 7 p.m. What made this detail particularly chilling was what the janitor supposedly saw before backing quietly out of the room to call police, a .44 Magnum revolver sticking out of the man's pocket. By the time officers arrived, the man was gone, slipping away into the night like some nightmare creature returning to the darkness. Spring break came and went in a haze of anxiety. My parents suggested canceling our planned trip to visit my grandparents, concerned about leaving town with a potential school shooter still at large. But I insisted we go. I needed the distance, needed to be somewhere that didn't remind me of those terrifying minutes in the dark. When we returned to school the following Monday, everything had changed. Security guards patrolled the hallways. Visitors had to check in with ID. Teachers kept classroom doors locked at all times. And all of us, students and faculty alike, jumped at loud noises and eyed strangers with suspicion. I found myself studying the faces of men on the street, in stores, at the mall, wondering if one of them was him, wondering if he would come back to finish what he started. The spring semester crawled by under this cloud of fear. Prom came and went. I did ask Jessica, finally, and she said yes. Graduation approached, and still, there was no word about the man being caught. On the last day of school, Mr. Denton pulled me aside after class. "You've seemed distracted these last few months," he said, concern evident in his eyes. Still thinking about what happened, I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "Me too," he admitted, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I keep wondering what I would have done if he'd gotten through that door. Do you think they'll ever find him?" I asked. Mr. Denton sighed. "I hope so, for all our sakes. It's been 5 years since that day. I'm in my senior year of college now, studying to become a teacher myself. The man was never found, as far as I know. Sometimes I wonder if he was ever even real, or if he was just some manifestation of our collective fears in an increasingly dangerous world. But then I remember the sound of his fists against our classroom door, the inhuman rage in his voice, and I know he was real. I know how close we came to becoming another statistic, another school shooting for the media to dissect and politicians to argue over. In my darkest moments, I imagine him still out there, planning his return, maybe to another school, maybe to ours, maybe he's receiving treatment, learning to manage whatever demons drove him to our door that day. Or maybe he's just waiting for the right moment, the right vulnerability to finish what he started. I don't know which scenario scares me more. What I do know is this: there are moments that divide life into before and after. And sometimes the after is a place where you learn to live with the knowledge that the monsters from childhood stories are real, wearing human skin, carrying human weapons, and walking among us every day. And the doors we put between ourselves and them are far more fragile than we'd like to believe.